Hello everyone, my name is Dennis G. Patterson, and I would like to thank you for joining me to hear my capstone research oral defense in preparation for the capstone graduate thesis. The title of my capstone proposal is Revisions to the U.S. Endangered Species Act will increase recovery rates of threatened and endangered species and their habitats. Our agenda will consist of research questions, justification of research questions, thesis statement, background, sources of data, analytic procedures, significance of research, and references. The questions this research will attempt to answer are: 1. To what extent are the provisions of the Endangered Species Act currently moving threatened and endangered species towards recovery? 2. In what way is Section 7 of the ESA possibly being abused? And 3. How are Section 10 requirements possibly undermining the ESA's effectiveness? Next, let's talk about the justification of research questions. After President Nixon signed the ESA into law in 1973, it became the country's primary law for the protection of threatened and endangered species. Today, this law is responsible for protecting almost 1,600 different species. Despite the billions of dollars spent annually to protect these species, there are very few cases of species reaching a point where they are capable of being delisted. The National Wildlife Foundation shows the number of domestic species removed from the endangered species list over its 46 years of existence. 37 were removed, with only 13 removed for full recovery. There were 9 species removed for extinction, and the remainder of the species were removed as a result of new information. This research will look at Sections 7 and 10 of the ESA to determine if possible revisions to these sections could result in increasing threatened and endangered species recovery rates. These sections primarily deal with incidental take permits and habitat conservation plans. It is believed by many that these sections are not providing adequate protections because federal agencies and courts are failing to strictly enforce these laws. This is likely due to increasing pressures to decrease economic impacts. It is possible that failure to execute Endangered Species Act laws as they were originally intended is leading to increased species and habitat vulnerabilities that will only continue to grow unless addressed. The thesis statement for this research is: new revisions to the Endangered Species Act are required to increase survival rates of threatened and endangered species and their critical habitats. This research attempts to confirm the following 3 hypotheses. 1. Current provisions of the ESA are not providing sufficient protections for threatened and endangered species. 2. Section 7 incidental take permits are being abused due to increased pressure on environmental agencies and courts to reduce impacts on the economy. And 3, Section 10 habitat conservation plans are being used as a means of bypassing Endangered Species Act protections on endangered habitats. The ESA has been one of the most successful pieces of environmental legislation ever created. Unfortunately, even with this powerful set of laws to protect threatened and endangered species, it is still proven to be a near impossible task. Environmental agencies are many times forced to operate on extremely limited budgets, and usually expenditures that are made are unevenly spent on rather small groups of charismatic species, leaving a huge population of other species to fend for themselves. In the 46 plus years since the ESA has been passed, there have been many species that have benefited from this law's protections. Unfortunately, only about 2% of all species ever listed under the ESA have ever reached a point where they could even be considered for delisting. It has been determined the longer a species remains on the ESL, the more likely the odds are in favor of a species recovery. Unfortunately, species who are unable to be placed on the list will face higher odds of decreasing in numbers or extinction. The ESA has failed to be revised in order to keep up with our rapidly growing socioeconomic changes that are occurring in the United States. The U.S. population alone has grown by over 50% since 1973, and it is expected to continue along these lines of growth. It is imperative that sections of the ESA are more closely studied and revised to provide more current and up-to-date protections that take into consideration current and projected socioeconomic data. It should also provide more specific definitions for keywords that are many times interpreted in many different ways. This research will focus primarily on Sections 7 and 10 of the ESA. In almost all species recovery plans, the main threat to threatened and endangered species are habitat loss and degradation. These are mostly due to anthropocentric or anthropogenic activities. The already mentioned sections of the ESA have currently made access to sensitive habitat areas available to unnecessary risk and hazards. Oftentimes, wording within the ESA is improperly interpreted to benefit humans rather than the species the laws were intended to protect. Some of the primary concerns by many is why federal agencies are failing to halt or modify projects that fall under Sections 7 and 10 more frequently. Stricter regulation is required to protect species and their habitat. Many are concerned with the inconsistent reviews given by expert scientists that continues to degrade any legitimate confidence in research. This also creates a sense of hesitance to trust scientific evidence. This research will utilize a mixed method design that will execute both meta-analysis and analysis of collected field data. The data utilized for the meta-analysis will be selected from scholarly sources located within the American Public University System Richard G. Greffrey Library. Peer-reviewed journal articles and studies will comprise the greatest part of the material utilized from the university library. Gray literature and reports will also be utilized from various government and private organizations. The data analysis method selected for this research is a convergent parallel mix method. Utilizing this method will allow data collection, analysis, and then a combination of both quantitative and qualitative data. The collection of quantitative data will take place by conducting surveys and questionnaires. The research responses will then be developed into quantitative data. The next step will be to collect qualitative data to help validate or disprove quantitative data findings. The quantitative data collected from surveys and questionnaires will allow the measurement of environmental employee approvals of Section 7 and 10 of the Endangered Species Act. Possible interviews may be conducted to further support or clarify results if they are needed. Once all data has been collected, both data types are compared or related. This will allow data types to complement each other, providing a more accurate analysis. The regression analysis is a statistical method being considered for data comparison. This will compare one or more independent variables with a dependent variable. This type of analysis is also desired when trying to make improvements. The proposed visuals being considered for use will be the pie chart to show overall percentages of responses from the surveys and questionnaires. The use of a column chart to show the total number of individuals involved in the surveys and questionnaires, and would also include data responses from the results of Section 7 and 10 questions. As this research is further developed, new or additional visual representations can be used to support or replace those mentioned. The revisions that this research is looking to recommend to the Endangered Species Act is critical to protecting our environment from our country's explosive socio-economic expansion. To assume we can continue to operate as we have been since the ESA was first conceived over 46 years ago could be a death sentence to hundreds or even thousands of threatened and endangered species and their critical habitats. This research will only look at two sections of the ESA that have been rumored to allow governments and the private sector to bypass the original intent of one of our most important environmental laws. It is believed that by simply revising these sections to provide clearly defined wording will prevent improperly defining the law's true intent and will stop anthropogenic expansion into sensitive wildlife habitats. It is time to stop the dangerous modification and fragmentation of critical habitats that support our threatened and endangered species. If we continue to allow many invasions of critical habitat and the taking of endangered species, our environment will eventually face a death by 1,000 cuts.